Good. I'll sit down for a while now. Before I talk about points 5 and 6, I'd like to just say a little bit more about these objectives for our courses. You can do a whole course. You could do a whole course on how to write good objectives. So I'm just summarizing things very briefly here. I've mentioned that they should be formulated in terms of what the students will do. And as well as that, we need to have different areas of objectives. We need to consider not just what students know in their head knowledge, but also what kind of people they are becoming, how they were growing spiritually, very important, and how they are learning new skills and abilities for ministry and just for good Christian living. So there are 3 areas: knowing, doing, and being. In technical language, that's cognitive objectives, affective objectives, and psychomotor objectives. Let's just say know, do, and be, and then we'll remember them more easily. But some of our objectives ought to consider each of those areas. In the early days of TE, and sometimes still, we used to use a little diagram of a fence. We called it the split rail fence. And I haven't got a board to draw it on right now, but it was a good strong fence a split rail fence has 2 long boards like this and strong posts in between to keep the cows in or out. Right. And we used to use that model, and we'd say the top rail represents knowing, information, and the bottom rail represented skills and how to do things. And we might put a 3rd rail in about growing as a person and as a Christian. But you also need strong posts to hold these together, to integrate them. And so we used to ask people to draw their own education like a split rail fence. Illustrate how you learned, and you might like to try that too. And most people would have a very heavy knowing rail. A lot of cognitive input. They got a lot of information. And then doing or being was a little rail, and the posts connecting the fence were not very strong. So if you want a good integrated curriculum, always think about knowing, being, and doing, and how to integrate them into a whole. And that takes some thinking, but it's important for any vocational training, but certainly for Christian ministry of any kind as well. One of the problems with some of the objectives that we write for training is that it may be very hard to measure them. We cannot look inside the student's head and see what he knows. So how do we find out what they've learned? Well, we have to have some outward assessment of that. Not necessarily tests and exams, maybe, but I guess we're going to be looking at people's behavior, looking at their ministry skills, their personal evangelism skills, and so on. So we try to write objectives that are measurable. And so right at the beginning, we always say in workshops, before you write your objective or finalise it, think about, could we measure it? How will we know if the students attained this or not? Do we just hope? Well, Lord, I hope they learn something. Or do we have some way to measure it? And that's another field of study. But I draw that to your attention because it is very important to try to write measurable objectives so that we want to know whether we're succeeding. And we also want to know whether our graduates are going on in their Christian lives or their ministries, whatever, achieving and benefiting from the training we gave them. On another day, we'll talk a little bit about the problems of transfer. How do you transfer what you learned in the classroom into real life, into real ministry, into Christian living, in your job, in your family, whatever? And transfer is a difficult thing to achieve. And so often our programs give a lot of head knowledge, but it isn't being transferred to real life. So this is one of our challenges. If we write our objectives in such a way as it's possible to measure achievement, that's good. I remember working with some Bible colleges as well as TE programs and we used to ask them to do a study of their graduates several years afterwards to see how much the training had benefited them. And it was very interesting to see sometimes what happened. And for example, there was one program that its aim was to train pastors. But after they trained a number of students, but their objective was pastors. When they looked at where their graduates were, they had more taxi drivers than pastors. And they only had 6 pastors. And I think it had taken them, I forget the figures, but 25 years and several $1 million to train just a handful of pastors. So we always want to look at our own objectives and try to see if we're achieving them. Many of you are working not to train pastors, but ordinary Christians to live a better Christian life. How do we measure that? So it's important to think about that as you write your objectives. So I just wanted to mention that. If your aim is to train Sunday school teachers, youth workers, teenagers, general Christian people, that's what you want to see if it's being achieved. What's happening, and so we have to be rigorous in assessing the results of our training to see if it's working. So it is important to get those objectives accessible, measurable, and include knowing, being, and doing. And of course, being, attitudes, values, spirituality, is the hardest to measure. You can't just give a test for that. But you can think about ways that you can see in people's lives if they're growing spiritually. Well, then we come to designing the curriculum, part B here. And the objectives of our program are broad, that we've formulated, are broad general objectives. When we write our individual courses, we would say, try to break those down into smaller objectives. But we're not doing course design this week, looking at curriculum. So what we do then, we look at our general objectives and we say, what content and what learning activities will the students need in order to reach those objectives? So, are we just going to give them knowledge for its own sake, or are we going to pick Bible teaching, practical teaching, whatever, to meet our objectives? And so it's not just content, it's also learning activities. What sorts of practical things do we want them to do? Do we want to encourage development of good critical thinking skills? That's something I'm often asked to help people work with. Do we need to perhaps design activities where people get used to working in groups and teams, doing things together? Because in ministry we don't always do things alone. So that you think about the broader learning activities as well as content that you would like to go into your program that would help you to meet your objectives for your TE program. That's the important thing. And when we've thought about that, we do have to think a lot about contextualization, and you will have a session on that a little later. But my own feeling is that one of the biggest failings in a lot of theological education, not just TE, is that it's not always well contextualized. So to the people it may seem this is a somewhat foreign thing, you know? And we're learning it, in some countries you're learning it in a foreign language as well. And so it's all up there somewhere, and your real life is here. So meeting the needs, the felt needs in our own context, it worries me a lot that many countries that I have visited and worked with are externally very Christian, much more Christian than my country, apparently. But the phrase that Graham used yesterday, I think, is very common. The Christianity can be miles wide and just inches deep. And some of the countries that have apparently the strongest churches have huge corruption all the way down, you know, and crime and everything is bad. So the Christianity is not reaching the context, the real context in those countries. And I think this is a tremendous challenge, particularly if we're training ordinary Christian people in the church. Are we addressing what does it mean to be a Christian in the workplace? Ordinary work. What does it mean to be an employer, an employee? What does it mean to be a good citizen of your community and your country? What does it mean to celebrate and enjoy your culture, but to do so critically from a biblical perspective? Because in every culture there are wonderful things and also things that, as a Christian, we would not follow. So getting to that context with lay training is very important. Helping people to live as Christians so that people will see, if they're looking for somebody who can be absolutely incorruptible, they're going to look at a church. That's what should be happening. That person, yeah, they're a Christian. They will never be corrupt. We can trust them with our money or our funds or whatever. That's the sort of thing I think we all want to see, you know. And so teaching to the context as we design the content and the learning activities. It's very important. And then, of course, we need to arrange our objectives, our content, and the learning activities into logical groupings so that we can begin to work out what courses we need to make up the whole curriculum. And we have to be realistic. How many TE courses can we realistically offer with the funds we have, the people we have, the situation? Some might only be able to do several courses. Others, like I think here in Korea, are offering a large number of TE courses, and that's terrific. But whatever your context is, what is the realistic number of subjects or courses you can offer? And then it doesn't matter if one objective is addressed in several courses. That may be good. But we need to design a realistic curriculum with courses that make sure that each one of our objectives is met at least in one course, maybe in more than one. You see the idea there. So we're working with a model from needs, objectives and context through to the actual courses. And then all the time we're considering how will we assess whether our students have achieved the desired outcomes. And we look at sequence. What is the best order in which to offer the courses? And sometimes that's hard to arrange ideally because of practical considerations. But ideally, which subjects or courses should come first? And those of you doing some basic Seon courses, you will start with those ones, I assume. Abundant life, abundant light, and so on. But then what comes next? What are we building? What is a logical sequence or order? And that's all part of it. And always thinking about how will we assess whether our students have actually achieved the objectives that we want to see. And then you begin to add more details to finalize your curriculum. And we always say that in any course design, there are limitations or strictures. You can't do everything you want. There's always a circle within which we have to move. There are always some restrictions. In some countries, they're government restrictions. There are always restrictions on money, time, personnel. So we have to work within what is realistic in our context. But I might also encourage those of you working in TE, any opportunities that you get to encourage those who can help you to put in more funding would be good. I think most of the funding goes to residential colleges. But actually, TE can train a lot more people, pastors as well as lay people. And TE programs do not require a big building. They do not require a lot of the expenses that go with a college. And especially in a poorer country, that's very important. But just one question that I sometimes ask when people say, well, we haven't got enough money to write any courses ourselves, we haven't got enough money to do what we want in TE. A question to ask sometimes is, ask others, what are all these things? Please tell me what all these things are that are so much more important for our money than training national Christian leaders. Please tell us what all the things that are so much more important, because that's where all the money is often going. So, training leaders by TE or in some other form is a very important priority. And let's keep reminding people that it is an important priority and that we can reach so many people and bless so many. So that's a basic a very basic introduction to a curriculum design model. There is very much more that could be said, but we'd like you, if perhaps Graham wouldn't mind pulling that board around, and we'll give you time to discuss a little bit more about context in your own setting. So and anything else that we've discussed this morning that you may want to raise. But I've asked you here to think about what are some of the contextual issues, the situation issues that your TE program is addressing, and are there other things in your context that you would like to have some courses to address that you think are important but which haven't yet been perhaps addressed. So you might share with one another, and in the group there is always lots of wisdom, and just think for a moment about the hundreds of years of experience in TE that we have in this room. So let's make the most of it. Okay?